The town whispered her name long before they ever saw her. She was a shadow that lived at the edges of their lives, a figure stitched together by rumor, tragedy, and fear. They called her the Black Widow, not because she had chosen the name, but because it fit her life so seamlessly. Her husband had died under strange circumstances, his body found in the barn one morning, slumped against the wall with eyes wide open, frozen in an expression no one could quite describe. Some said it was terror, others said it was guilt. Whatever it was, it clung to him like a final truth that he had carried to the grave. She did not weep at his funeral. She stood there in her black veil, face hidden, hands clasped tightly as though holding on to something no one else could see. The townspeople took her silence as confirmation of all the things they already believed, that she had wanted him gone, that she had planned it, that she was already thinking of her next move. But the truth was never so simple. Her husband's death had not given her peace. If anything, it left her with an emptiness that demanded to be filled. It was whispered that he had secrets, dealings with men who preferred to keep their business hidden in smoke-filled rooms and back alleys. He had made enemies, the kind who did not forgive, and the kind who could not be bought. He had also made promises that bound her to dangers she did not yet understand. When he was lowered into the ground, she knew his death was not an ending, but the beginning of something far darker. The Black Widow became a figure of obsession for the town. Some nights, they saw her walking alone in the fields, the hem of her dress sweeping the tall grass as though she were searching for something. Other times, she appeared in the market, silent, her eyes lingering too long on certain faces, making people shift uncomfortably and look away. She never raised her voice, never accused, never defended herself. She carried her silence like a weapon. But vengeance, like grief, has its own hunger. It seeps into the cracks of everyday life, demanding to be fed. And the widow fed it in ways no one could quite trace. Men who had once been close to her husband began to disappear. One by one, their names turned into whispers, their faces fading from the taverns, from the meetings, from the town itself. At first, people thought they had fled. But rumors spread of bodies found far away, washed up near rivers, buried in shallow graves, or never found at all. Each death was a thread, and all the threads led back to her. And yet, there was no proof. No one ever saw her do anything. No one ever found the evidence that tied her to the string of quiet tragedies that followed her husband's death. She was always in plain sight, always calm, always untouchable. The more they tried to uncover, the deeper the mystery grew. She never remarried. Suitors came, drawn by her beauty and the strange allure of her silence, but she turned them all away. To her, love was no longer a word that meant warmth or comfort. It was a transaction, a weapon, a tool. Love had been taken from her, twisted into something unrecognizable, and in its place grew vengeance. Years passed and the town changed. New faces came, old ones left, but the legend of the Black Widow only grew stronger. Children whispered her story around fires, daring each other to walk past her house at night. Some swore they saw candlelight flickering in her windows at odd hours, shadows moving across the curtains. Others claimed she spoke to no one but the dead, her voice drifting through the night air like a prayer or a curse. What no one knew was that her vengeance had never truly ended. It had no neat conclusion, no moment of justice delivered with finality. Every man she struck down was a piece of a puzzle that never seemed complete. Each act of retribution left her both satisfied and hollow, driving her further into the cycle she could not escape. It was not about justice anymore. It was survival. It was obsession. It was the only thing that tethered her to the world. She grew old, but age did not soften her. The lines on her face deepened, her hair silvered, but her eyes remained sharp, unyielding. The town avoided her, not out of respect, but out of fear. They did not know whether she was finished, whether the vengeance she carried had finally been laid to rest, or whether she was only waiting, patient as ever, for her next name, her next target, her next ghost to join the growing list of the unsolved. In the end, no one knew what became of her. Some said she died alone in her house, her body found weeks later, her eyes open, staring at something no one else could see. Others swore she simply vanished, slipping into the night like the shadow she had always been. What was certain was this: the Black Widow's vengeance was never solved, never understood, and never forgotten. It lingered in the air long after she was gone, a warning, a curse, a legend that lived on in every whispered story. The story of the Black Widow did not end when her body grew frail or when her house was left to rot at the edge of the town. It lived on, stitched into the fabric of every whisper, every uneasy glance, every firelit tale told to silence children before sleep. What made her story unshakable was not only the deaths that seemed to orbit her, but the way those deaths carried with them an air of inevitability, as though the widow was less a woman and more a force summoned by betrayal itself. There were stories the townsfolk never dared to tell in daylight. One of them spoke of a night when a man, drunk and bold, claimed loudly in the tavern that he would go to her house and prove once and for all that she was nothing but a lonely old widow with nothing left but her shadow. They laughed at him, clapped his back, poured him another drink, and watched him swagger into the dark street. He never returned. By morning, all they found was his hat lying in the ditch, soaked through with rain. The widow never spoke of him, and no one asked. Another tale said she had kept a ledger, a book that her husband once used to record debts, bribes, and names of men who would rather forget their dealings. After his death, it was said she turned the ledger into something darker. Every name in that book became a vow, a reminder that her vengeance was not random, but systematic. Those who believed the tale said the book grew thinner over the years, each name carefully crossed out until only blank pages remained. But no one ever found the ledger. Some whispered that when she disappeared, she took it with her, binding her vengeance to it even beyond the grave. There were those who claimed to see her long after she was supposed to be gone. A figure in black moving across the fields at dusk, or standing at the edge of the churchyard, veil pulled low, as though watching but never joining. Farmers swore that on nights, when the wind carried a certain sharpness, they saw a candle burning in her upstairs window, the flame flickering against the glass though the house had been abandoned for years. The Black Widow was no longer just a person. She had become a symbol, a story people carried in their bones. Wives spoke of her when their husbands drank too much and stayed too late, a reminder that betrayal did not go unpunished. Children dared each other to knock on the door of her crumbling house, their laughter faltering when the silence seemed too deep, too watchful. Old men who had once known her husband avoided the subject entirely, their eyes darkening with memories they refused to share. But perhaps the most haunting part of her story was not what she did, but what was left undone. The vengeance she carried was like a chain with no end, a curse that fed on itself. No one ever knew if she had finished her list, if the last name had been crossed from her secret ledger, or if there were still debts to be paid. The uncertainty was what gave her legend its power. Long after the widow's house finally collapsed, after the fields swallowed the paths she once walked, her name lingered. When men vanished under mysterious circumstances, when guilt seemed to rot a man from the inside out, when fear made the bravest falter, the townsfolk had only one explanation: the Black Widow had returned. They never said her vengeance was over. They said only that it was waiting. Waiting in the quiet, in the shadows, in the spaces where guilt lived unspoken. For the Black Widow was not just a woman wronged. She was vengeance itself, unsolved, unending, and patient enough to outlive even death. Her story grew heavier with every year that passed, like mist that refused to lift from the valley. The town carried her name as though it were a curse, spoken in hushed tones in places where candlelight flickered against old wood. They said the Black Widow's vengeance was not merely human, not merely the act of a grieving woman left behind, but something older, something elemental that had chosen her as its vessel. Before her husband died, there had been whispers of cruelty in their home. He was a man whose smile never reached his eyes, whose words cut sharper than any blade. Neighbors recalled the bruises she had once hidden beneath lace gloves, the moments she walked through town with eyes that seemed as if they had been emptied of hope. When he was found dead in the barn, the townsfolk muttered about poison, about plots, about a woman finally pushed too far. Yet what none of them considered was that perhaps his death had not been her doing at all, that perhaps it was the beginning of a chain that no mortal hand could stop. There were accounts of dreams. Men who had crossed her husband in business, who had cheated him or plotted against him, swore they woke in the night drenched in sweat, her veiled figure standing at the edge of their bed, unmoving, silent, her eyes burning through the darkness. A few fled town after such dreams, abandoning their fortunes, their families, their pride, as though simply leaving could shake her from their souls. But distance offered no protection. They died just the same, far away, alone, often with lips cracked into a final expression of fear. And yet, she remained untouchable. The sheriff once tried to confront her, armed with questions and suspicions that weighed like stones in his pockets. He left her house pale and silent, refusing to speak of what he had seen within those walls. His hair grayed within the month, and he never again mentioned her name. Her home itself seemed to conspire with her legend. Windows fogged without reason, doors creaked when no wind stirred, and ivy climbed so thickly over the walls that the house seemed less built of wood and stone than of earth reclaiming its own. At night, travelers swore they saw faint lights weaving through the upstairs rooms, like lanterns carried by unseen hands. The widow herself was sometimes glimpsed at her window, the veil pulled back, her face pale in the glow of the candle, but her eyes, those eyes, never blinked, never moved. They watched as if the town itself were a living thing she kept tethered. As years turned into decades, her body aged, but the vengeance never did. Some believed the spirit of her dead husband clung to her, binding her to the earth until every debt he had incurred was repaid in blood. Others believed she was no longer human, that grief had hollowed her out so completely that vengeance stepped in to fill the void, wearing her as its skin. When her house was finally found empty, its walls cold, its hearth black with soot, no one claimed her body. No grave bore her name. The townsfolk never spoke of funerals, never whispered of a burial. She was simply gone, as though she had been swallowed by the very shadows that had carried her for so long. But her absence brought no peace. Even after she vanished, misfortunes still followed those who had once shared in her husband's dealings. Cattle died in strange numbers, harvests rotted from the inside out, children woke screaming in the night, swearing they had seen a veiled woman standing in their doorways. Those who still remembered her face never doubted what it meant. The Black Widow's vengeance was never solved because it was never meant to be solved. It was not a riddle to be answered or a crime to be explained. It was a hunger, eternal and insatiable, carried in the air of that town like smoke from a fire that never burned out. And so her story lived on, not in the brittle pages of history, but in the marrow of every soul that dared whisper her name. For some forces are not meant to rest, and vengeance, when it grows too deep, too old, too fierce, cannot be buried. It waits, always,